That would be my biggest question to the very intelligent, smart people like Bill Gates who have made statements kind of contrary to that idea. What happens to our cow? What happens to this system? What happens to our soils when you pull cows out of the equation? It's just a very simple, sincere question.
This is the Real Food, Real People podcast.
Growing carbon neutral beef and dairy products. Is it possible? A lot of people think it's quite the opposite. But this week we talk with a farmer who says it's absolutely possible, and he's getting very close to doing it on his own farm. In fact, he might even be there. He'll explain how he's trying to quantify this and the lessons he's learned along the way. We talk with Austin Allred. He has a large dairy in the Royal City area. He also produces beef. The rest of his family is also involved in tree fruit and other vegetable crops, etc. And he says there's one key to it all that might shock you what it is to make carbon neutral happen in our food system, at least sustainably into the long term. He says that's the important part beyond just being able to do it for a few years. He says the long term is so important, and that's what's important to his family, multi-generational family farm. Again, Austin Allred is his name. We go to Royal City to talk with him here on the Real Food, Real People podcast. I'm Dylan Honcoop, and this is my continuing journey to get to know the real people behind our food produced here in Washington State. Our sponsors are Mana Insurance Group, based here in Washington, based right in the town where I grew up in Linden, and it's a classmate of mine from high school that founded the company, a great guy, and I know several people on his team. They're honest, hardworking people who really care about getting the best result for you and protecting your family's financial future, not just picking up the pieces when things go wrong. They also have locations in California and Arizona. Also, Dairy Farmers of Washington. And they are always sharing stories like the one that we'll be hearing today from Austin Allred about the amazing things that dairy farms here in Washington State are doing that you may have never heard about. There's a lot that goes on that never makes the headlines per se, and they are trying to change that and show what's really happening on our dairy farms here in Washington State. Their website is wadairy.org. Again, the Dairy Farmers of Washington. I'd appreciate you check them out and check out their website, including their virtual farm tour. Why do you do it? What you do? I mean, you put any farming is hard, and you're trying to kind of take the farming and the way you do it to the next level. What drives you to put in that kind of effort day in and day out?
So you're asking why I do not just farming, but why I do farming, like, and trying to kind of put myself out there a little bit.
Yeah, and the innovative stuff that you do on your farm, I want to talk about that and get some of those details. But first, I just want to know what drives that passion that you have for it.
I think if I was to boil it down, I think I really do not like the misconceptions about farming. And I think I understand enough because I am whatever, I'm a millennial and I've kind of been in that world enough. I grew up in this world to understand some of the misconceptions, to understand even some of the mistakes we're making. And so I want to try to figure that piece out. I think that's a real passion of mine, is to figure the misconceptions out, to educate people, and then, I mean, I guess before that, to improve on them, and then to educate people on what we're doing to make it better.
So what about the food piece? Like, you produce food that people eat. How does that play into it?
I mean, that's why I'm a farmer. That's why I love doing what I do. It's not necessarily why I go above and beyond to try to be innovative, because I could be a pretty good farmer without putting myself out there and taking all the risk on the new and improved version of farming. But there's very few people that get a farm, but there's also just very few people in today's world that get to make a living by producing something, let alone producing, in my opinion, the greatest proteins on the earth. And I think my opinion is pretty well backed up by a lot of people.
Explain that, because, a lot of people are not so sure about milk. You're hearing people like hearing from doctors and some nutritionists and stuff saying negative things about milk or dairy products. You're telling a totally different story. How is that?
Yeah, milk and beef. A cow's system, a cow's 4 stomachs, I believe God created them to take the very good soil products such as grass, and even corn is in that, if we talked about that a little more, to take those products that are the best for the soils. I think they're the best for the even the carbon footprint, and cows. If you look at cows as a machine, they're able to convert those into proteins, into energy, into really wholesome, readily available products that we're able to utilize in our 1-part stomach, if you will.
Right.
So, I think cows serve a fantastic purpose. If you look at it just in the nutrition sector alone, in keeping us healthy.
So talk about, a little bit more about the nutrition element. You talk about such important proteins. What is that in milk and beef?
Yeah, milk and beef. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a nutritionist, and this is not like my area of expertise. I got a couple buddies that very much are in this world, and I talk to them a lot about it. I even follow, I wish I could remember, there's a lady who's a nutritionist who is very good. I follow on Instagram, and I could look that up here in a sec. But so they're better to really talk about this.
Yeah.
But I do track macros, and I don't know how other people do on macros, but I have a buddy who does this professionally, and he helps me. I have a really hard time doing that without animal proteins. And so if you look at macros and trying to eat the right amount of food, the right amount of fat, the right amount of, the different nutrients, without beef, without milk, without yogurt, without cheese, without even like my snack pack of turkey, and without all those products that we make, especially that cows make and other animals too. But I don't know if I could do it. Not just because I'm picky. I'm not that picky, but because I don't know how I could fill the protein void and the fat void without surpassing the other void. It just doesn't fit. I don't know if you guys are familiar with macros, but anyway, so that's as far as my real nutrition knowledge goes.
Well, that's been my personal experience just within the last year or so. I've been trying to get more healthy, lose some weight, stuff like that. And really the key to me doing that is
high protein,
high fat even.
Yeah.
Which is totally backwards from kind of what the establishment has talked about for years. But more and more people are seeing that, realizing that, experiencing that. And it sounded interesting to me, but until I experienced it personally, I didn't really get it. But it is true. It's like those are key parts of my diet. And actually, if I'm taking those out, I'm filling my diet with more empty carb calories that are not benefiting my health.
And have so much other junk with them.
Yeah.
When you're having the proteins we're talking about, there is no junk.
Right.
It's a very short label.
Yeah, it's not processed with this, that, and the other thing.
And I think another part of this conversation, because I've watched some of the documentaries that have the professional athletes who are vegan, and that's all fine and dandy, and I really am okay with people being vegan. Yeah. But if you want to talk about the most vulnerable, the poor in our society and the poor in other societies, that's not a conversation they can have.
Yeah.
I mean, again, there's a huge part of this conversation with readily available, high protein, good nutrient sources. And that's the part to combat some of these, fancy vegans saying, well, actually you can get your macros. I've been to Haiti a few times. Tell them that, I don't know what they eat, but go get your nuts or whatever. And I like nuts, but I'm just saying, That's a big part of the conversation.
Yeah, it can get a little bit bougie. Like, oh, well, everybody should do this. Well, that's great if everybody could afford that.
And if those were, and if we could sustainably grow those products to be able to give everybody that option, but I don't see that path forward. So it comes down to the protein and the awesome source of food we get through these bovine, through these nutrient systems or these ruminant systems. And
so you're saying it starts in the field. Like this nutrition element that we're talking about, humans and what we put in our gut and what we fuel our bodies with and how we get healthy starts in your fields.
Exactly. Yes. Cows, bovine, because the English language is tough when we're talking about cows, because cows are mature females that have had a baby. So anyway, cattle, bovine. Yeah. Just to be technically correct, because I'm a cattle farmer. So, yes, very much so, and that is a big part of what I am trying to do, is to integrate the systems a little bit better, and then tell that story, because cattle are the ultimate provider for healthy soils. Cows are critical to healthy soils, and healthy soils are critical to cows. And so the marriage that they have is the answer that I think we're all looking for when we talk about carbon footprints and being, responsible consumers. We can be.
So this cycle with cows relying on healthy soil and crops to eat, and the crops relying on the cows then to fertilize them, is what I'm assuming you're saying. The cycle, how does that come to bear on our carbon situation right now, and as climate change becomes more and more of a focus?
Yeah, so we have a system called Farm Tracer that we teamed up with a tech company to help us sort this out. And so we track the carbon footprint of all of our animals, because there is an emission that comes with any mammal who's utilizing energy.
Including humans in a big way.
Us. For the record, cows don't fart. I'm going to make a T-shirt. I really am. It's going to say cows don't fart, because they don't. They burp, but nonetheless, they have an emission. And we take that, and we also track our footprint of our farm, of the crops, the carbon footprint of the crops that we grow. And it's not hard. Most all farms are going to be, most all row crop farms are going to be sequestering carbon. That's what photosynthesis is. And you certainly
taking carbon from the atmosphere. The plants use that in their own
photosynthesis.
Energy producing process. And then some of it goes into the soil, right?
Correct.
And then some of it goes out as feed, which the cows eat, comes out the other end and goes into the soil.
Yeah. So that's the process that we're trying to improve and we're trying to do. That is called, that essentially is what regenerative farming is in a nutshell. There's different pillars to regenerative farming, but it's adding the biodiversity, adding the relationship with cattle to your fields, so that you can have a better flow of carbon through your soils and into your soils. And so to get back in Farm Tracer, we're on a very macro and micro scale. We're taking every animal that we grow and we're tracking their footprint. We are tracking how much feed those animals eat from our farm. And we are saying, and we have those numbers, and each animal will give you, you can scan your barcode. When you buy our meat from Royal Ranch, you scan the barcode and it shows you what the emissions from that animal was. And then it shows you how much pounds of our farm raised crops it ate, and what the sequestration that occurred in the growing of those crops because of our practices.
Wow.
You combine those, 100% of the time, thus far, that's negative. The plants they're growing is sequestering more carbon out of our atmosphere than those animals are emitting in their days of growing up.
So if it's negative, what's that adding up to, like on an annual basis for your farm?
I'm gonna look it. I'm gonna look
He's
it
got
up
it on his phone
for a certain animal, just because I want to be accurate here. So we have, I mean, Royal Dairy, we milk 6,000 cows.
Wow.
And I have that footprint. We're raising all those young stock here, and then we have probably 5,000-ish beef animals we're raising. So I'm going to look up one of our animals by its ear tag. I'm looking up 8011, which is just one that always is on the top of my head because I use it. This animal ate 10,000 pounds of grass and local forage, essentially stuff that we grew on our farm.
5 tons.
5 tons.
For one animal, which someone who doesn't understand that, I mean, this has been the criticism, right? Oh, that's, animals are eating all this food that cropland could have been growing vegetables for humans to eat and yada, yada. But I'm guessing what you're about to tell me is going to show a little bit different story.
Yeah, let's come back. That's a really good point. So what I'm saying, so with that 10,000, that 5 tons of food that animal ate that we grew on our regenerative practices, sequestered 4.119 CO2 equivalents per tons, equivalent tons.
Tons of CO2.
Tons of CO2.
Wow.
That's how much it sequestered out of the air. However, that animal admittedly emitted, by our estimation, and this is all through USDA system called Comet. It's a software system that we use, and we input all our stuff. 3.8 tons into the air. So the difference there is a negative 0.3 CO2 equivalent tons.
So if you look at just either one of those, you get a really skewed picture. Wow, there's 4 tons or whatever. I'm rounding numbers off. Of sequestration. Well, that's not the real story because the cow emitted some too. And a lot of people just look at that story. Oh, look how much emissions that cow makes. But when you balance that out in this cycle, this system, it's actually going in the right direction.
It's going in the right direction. And I think to go back to what you brought up about, if we grow all our crops, we could eat that. Because, that still doesn't cover that, right? I mean, that information there, somebody would simply say, well, get rid of the 3 tons of emissions and just grow all that crop, and you done deal, right? You're better off. Yeah, you're good, but you're better. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Am I making sense? Well, and that's the part that we've kind of addressed a little bit, but no, that is not a sustainable solution because our soils, those plants that are growing, they're not magically growing strictly from sunlight and water. Mm-hmm. If you go look at this cornfield, it's growing a couple inches a day. It's getting that from somewhere. It is cool. Photosynthesis is magic in my eyes, but it's coming from the soil. Sun and water is obviously a part of the process, but material is not created with sun and water. You know what I mean? Yeah. So that's coming out of your soil. So if you start taking cows out of the equation, your soils do not have the longevity that they need to make this a real solution for long term.
So you're saying like it has to come from somewhere. It's coming from the soil. And the concern has been that, well, farming is just depleting the soil of all of these nutrients. Like you're saying, that becomes the crops, it gets eaten. Where does it go? But you're saying there's the back end of that too, where it's what the cows produce that doesn't go down the road for people to eat in the store, that what comes out the other end goes and feeds that soil.
Correct. Yes. And I certainly need to preface this with, I don't want to fault farmers too much about the processes of the past. We all worked what we had to work with. And we fortunately have better understanding now than we did 2 decades ago. That's no argument. So with that in mind, there is a short-term, we can grow good crops by adding nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. We can. I mean, it makes good crops for the short term, though. because that plant is not simply nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. When you look at a corn plant, it's not made up of only those three elements.
Yep.
And that's where you come into manures and the biodiversity you add with cover crops. And you start doing that, and you start feeding your soils not just with the mined NP and K, because that's what we've been doing, and it's been working okay. But when you start talking long-term and generational, which, sidebar, farming, in my recollection, is some of the few industries that are almost all generational. So farmers, for argument's sake, have more to lose long-term than almost any other industry in this world. So anyway, they are concerned about it. They are, period. We're trying to figure it out the best way we can. In the last couple decades, it's not like farmers just kind of forget about that. We're working the best with what we had. Anyway, that was a sidebar. But so you take and you start putting back in your soils all these other pieces that you need, including a lot of the nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus that essentially just coming back through the manure. Mm-hmm. And then all the other compounds that I don't know how to pronounce and that I don't understand very well. But nonetheless, that plant is more than NP and K. Yeah. And so animals, manure, compost, worm castings too, are adding NP and K along with all these other compounds, carbon included, that are really essential for long-term healthy soils. I think it's relatable, and I'm not my cousins and my brothers, they're the ones who grow the crops. I'm not a great agronomist, if you will. Yeah. But at the end of the day, they very much look at, when they get their nutrient analysis from their soils, just like I get a nutrient analysis for my feed that I'm feeding my cows, they get that similar nutrient analysis for their soils that are essentially feeding their plants. When they look at that, I'm going to look at protein and fiber and starch and energy. They're going to look at nitrogen, some of the fertility numbers, but then they're going to look at carbon. And when they see a carbon number that's high, they will almost always see a greater yield. 1.5% carbon in their soils is good. 2.5%, you can expect 10% better yield.
So basically, if we sequester this carbon, which we have too much of in our atmosphere, and get it back into our soils, not only are we helping the atmosphere, but we're probably able to feed more people with the same amount of...
100%. I don't think there's any argument against that. Carbon in soils is better for soils, creates more yield on those acres. Yeah.
It's one of those cool situations where it's like mutually beneficial. It's like you do something good for the environment. The concern often is, well, it's going to cost a lot, or it's going to cause some other, negative or unintended consequence. This is like perfectly balanced as far as beneficial on both sides, it sounds like.
Yeah. And if you start looking at it, God set the system up right. And you go back to higher yields just to keep the flow going. Higher yields are going to in turn sequester more carbon. You know what I mean? So it's a full circle, and
a virtuous cycle versus a vicious cycle.
Yeah, that's how good articulate people would pronounce it, and that's good. That's why you're on that side of the seat.
You're too hard on yourself. You mentioned worm castings a minute ago. You are kind of a worm farmer too, on top of being a cattle farmer, right? Yeah. Explain what you do. I've looked at the system and learned quite a bit about it in the past, but explain what's the latest with what you guys are doing with worms and wood chips and water and manure and how those all work together.
Yeah, so I think there's a conversation similar to this one that we're having about carbon on water, right? That's another huge element to long-term success of our earth and our, what's going on, our growing crops, our feeding our people and everything else. So water's critical, just like soil's critical, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So we have a water filtration system here so that we can recycle all the water that we use on our farm. It's called a biofilter. And so we take all the water that we've used, including the cow's urine. We collect all of it we can. And that's most of it. We collect most of our cow's urine, and we collect most of all the water that we use to clean our systems and to clean things out. We collect that, and then we also collect all the rainwater that touches our footprint here. Mm-hmm. There's not some magical drain that goes somewhere. We are in charge of all that. So, long story short, we collect all that. We use a couple mechanical separators to try to pull out the most fibrous, the most solids we can from that.
Well, that's good organic material for soil, right?
That's all what we turn into compost. Mm-hmm. Great for soil. But then we're left with the dirty water, which is also good for soil. I mean, green water is good for soil. It can be used much like compost, but it's not as economical to get it there. And in the meantime, getting it there, you do have a lot of methane being released, and it's not a perfect system. So we take that water one step further, and we go into a biofilter, which is, in our case, 8 acres of worm beds that have sprinklers sitting on top of them, where this dirty water comes out.
8 acres. That's a big area.
8 acres of worms. It is a big area. So we come out, dirty green water comes out that's been contaminated on our farm. And when I say contaminated, I mean, it's manure. It's not,
right.
It's not.
It's been around cow poop.
Yeah. I just want to make that clear. It's not like some awful
dangerous chemical. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but anyway, it's been contaminated. We'll set that water, will come out those sprinklers, and it'll settle through about 3.5 feet of wood chips that have worms within them, millions of worms, and then a layer of rocks. And then we'll collect it off the bottom, much cleaner. We can then irrigate with it. Most of it, what we do with most of that water is we reuse it. So the water we clean, the vast majority of the water we use to clean our cow pens and our systems is reuse water. It's water that we've already used. Some of it was urine even. I mean, it is all reuse water. The only potable water we use is what the FDA requires us to use in the parlor where we actually make the milk.
Yep.
We feed the water the cows drink is potable, although we've already used that once to cool our milk a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then our baby calves obviously get clean water. And then when we wash the baby's bottles, we use potable water. Other than that, everything on our farm is reuse water. So long story.
That's got to reduce
that's
got to reduce your water consumption
of course
massively.
This other dialogue that dairies and cows are taking all our water. Yeah, cows drink a lot of water, but they give us a lot of milk. They upcycle that water, along with other systems in their rumen. And then most of the urine we're collecting. So that argument loses legs really pretty fast. But all the water we are using, we're reusing. 90% of the water we use here is reuse water. And that filtration system is pulling the nutrients out of that water, and it's putting it into those wood chips. And then the worms, who are a big part of that process of the filtration, are then digesting those nutrients, digesting that system. I mean, there's millions of worms in there, and they're pooping out worm poop or worm castings, and we are then harvesting that, and that's going all to soils too, to help biodiversify the soils, to help keep healthy soils for the long term. So again, it's just another example of using the natural systems, God's creation in a duplicated form, condensed, of course, because we don't need potable water. But you think about how we pull water out from our wells. It's been through layers of earth. Worms, that's what worms' digestive system is good for, is digesting food, pooping it out. And once a worm poops it out, it is gold for soil. It's gold for plants.
I've heard that these worm castings are incredibly healthy for soil. Lots of carbon, lots of good nutrients. Just makes great, rich beds for growing more food.
It does. Yeah.
So where do you use most of those, or do other people then take those? Because I know like what you do with compost, cow manure, worm castings, and whatnot. That helps support a lot of organic, like vegetable farming and other things like that around here, right?
Yeah. So our compost, certainly we use most of that on our own farm, but a lot of that goes to neighboring farms too. The worm castings, we use some of that on our orchards, but the people who have more value in worm castings than even we do for like some of our row crops are people who have greenhouses, marijuana farmers. And I guess let me rephrase that a little bit, because part of this conversation is just the availability of worm castings historically has not been there. So the people who could pay the most for the small limited supply of worm castings was your greenhouses, was your marijuana farmers, and some of those
The high dollar stuff.
Cash crops where you have 1 acre that's making a lot of money versus around here. I mean, 1 acre is a couple $100 at the end of the year. So anyway, I think that you get that. So this system itself has already, if I remember right, I mean, we've almost doubled the supply of worm castings in the nation.
Wow.
So
just from what you do here on your farm?
Yeah, I need to follow up with that, but it's substantial.
Wow.
So all of a sudden, we have way more worm castings to deal with these days because of this water filtration system. So already from in the last 2 years, we went from marking that pretty much all to California and to local, marijuana farmers and some greenhouses, to this year will be the first year where it's almost all going to orchard, vineyard supply companies. So already we're seeing that supply being able to feed, more outlets with this awesome plant and soil amendment, worm castings, versus what it could before, because simply we didn't have it.
Yeah, you take animals out of this whole system, the cows and the worms too, but a lot of people don't think about them because they're mostly beneath our feet. You take those out of the system, what keeps that loop going?
And that's
because it's almost a closed system. What drives that? And sounds like it's the cows.
That's
cattle.
Cattle. There.
The bovine.
The bovine. That would be my biggest question to the very intelligent, smart people like Bill Gates who have made statements kind of contrary to that idea. What happens to our cow? What happens to this system? What happens to our soils when you pull cows out of the equation? It's just a very simple, sincere question that I've put a lot of time and thought into, and it always comes back to cows are critical to a sustainable system, food system. And that's aside from the clear nutrient benefits that we started with.
So with all this carbon neutral, carbon tracking stuff that you're doing, what's the future of that? Where are you trying to get to with that?
Yeah, I mean, right now we're just focusing on our farm and what we have, what we can do with that, and how we can improve our systems with that. But we're hoping to be able to offer that to other farms as kind of a system that we've come up with that works. So we're hoping to be able to share that with others and to take Farm Tracer even to other farms to be able to say, hey, here it is. And what Farm Tracer is, it's just offering complete transparency to the consumer.
This is the Real Food, Real People podcast. These are the stories of the people who grow your food.